Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first week of English 584. I'm very happy that you've chosen to take this summer class with me. My name is Bernard Krumm. I received my PhD last year from Stony Brook University, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Emory University in Atlanta. Um, my area of expertise, my research is early modern literature, particularly Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I also focus on economic history, political theory, intellectual history, performance history. So my general approach to scholarship is certainly as an historicist, right? Um, so I know that many of you are coming to this class as aspiring teachers, right? I know some of you are part of the MAT program, so I welcome you. I also know some of you are receiving your master's degree in English, and so you may go on to pursue a PhD. You may go on to become, professional writers. You may go on to become teachers. So for whatever reasons that you're taking this class and that you're in the master's program, I want to welcome you to this class too. And also welcome to those of you who are pursuing a creative writing. And I've structured the course and I've designed the assignments basically to cater to all of the varying interests that I know will be represented in this class, right? So the first thing that I'll say is that, there are two major components to the course in terms of the assignments, right? You have weekly discussion posts where you write an initial post, and then a couple days later you write a reply to one of your peers, right? So taken together, the discussion posts and all the deadlines for those are outlined specifically on the syllabus, on the schedule, right? All of those deadlines are there, right? And taken all together, the discussion posts represent the largest portion of your grade, right? So it's extremely important that you do the discussion posts, you complete them on time, right? And you write your reply to a peer on time, right? And the syllabus asks you to write 400 words for the original post, and then 100 words, could be less, for the reply to your peer, right? In order to do those well, you only really have to read the primary readings, right? So mainly we're just reading the plays, right? I have suggested, recommended secondary readings for each play. It's entirely up to you whether or not you want to read those. I encourage you to do so. I think that will certainly enhance your understanding of the play, and they'll also give you a sense of how the plays have been interpreted over the years. But I understand that we're doing a lot in a short period of time. So if you want to skip those, that's understandable, and I won't hold it against you. But they're there for your own personal edification, if you like. So I think the main thing to keep in mind in order to do well in this course is to make sure that you meet every deadline, make sure that you keep up with the readings, make sure that you're listening to each of the lectures, right? And if something comes up that prevents you from meeting a deadline, or if you anticipate that you're going to have trouble meeting a deadline in a week or two or three or whatever, you need to let me know so we can come up with an alternative, right? Now, I've structured everything so that um, lectures and discussion posts, the prompts are available at the beginning of the week, right? So that means that you have a week to read the play, listen to the lecture, do the discussion post, write the reply, right? A week should be enough time to do all of that, right? If you figure it takes you 4 hours to read a Shakespeare play, plus 20 minutes to listen to the lecture, plus an hour or so to work on the discussion post, and then another 15 20 minutes to write a reply to a peer, right? All of that keeps you within 6 to 10 hours of work per week, right? It should be manageable. And I'm not really inclined to make any materials available ahead of time. You're free to read the plays ahead of time, right? You're free to get a jump start on the reading, right? Because all of that's available to you on the syllabus. And you're also free to begin working on your final projects as soon as you'd like, right? But as far as the assignments are concerned, I do have them at this pace because I think it's good that we're sort of like all completing the course at the same pace, right? So if you're getting access to material weeks in advance and you're rushing to do it all ahead of time, it doesn't really, I think it's not really conducive to doing the best work possible, right? So I think that making everything available Monday morning, giving you an entire week to, read the plays, listen to the lectures, do the discussion posts, and be done with it, I think all of that is an ample amount of time. But if circumstances warrant for you to have access to something ahead of time, if you believe that's the case, let me know, and that's something that we can talk about. And I'll make a decision as to whether or not I think it's a good idea for you to have access to something ahead of time, right? But try to keep with the pace of the course, right? So make sure you're keeping note of all the deadlines. Make sure that you're completing all the assignments on time. Make sure that you're reaching out ahead of time for extensions. Remember, the secondary readings are optional. Now, I know a couple of you have taken courses with me when I taught at Stony Brook as a graduate student. And based on the class roster, I have some sense of your degree progress and what your interests are. But when it comes to the final projects, you have a choice of three final projects, right? You can either do a research proposal for a project that engages with Shakespeare studies at some level, right? And there's a full description of that on the syllabus. You can also do a lesson plan, right? So if you're planning to become a high school or a college instructor, right, a lesson plan might be a good idea for you. And then there's also an adaptation concept, which might appeal to those of you who are creative writers, where basically you take a Shakespeare play and you adapt it into some new medium, new form, right? It could be a film treatment, it could be a novel proposal, right? It could be a poem, it could be a piece of music, it could be a new stage adaptation, a dance, a ballet, something. It doesn't matter, right? It could be anything you want, really. If you have a genre or a medium that you work in as a creative writer, then maybe that's the best way to go. Choose something like that, but it's really up to you. And also, none of you are pigeonholed into any of those final projects. So if you're a creative writer but you want to write a research proposal, go ahead. If you're a teacher but you want to do an adaptation concept, be my guest, right? It's really up to you, whatever you think is best for you in terms of your academic interests and also your personal interests, right? Because I think doing the work for this course is made a lot easier if you are able to draw on your own strengths and draw on your own interests, right? So if you've been writing academic essays, as part of your master's program, and you're like, I'm tired of that, I want to write an adaptation concept and do like a film adaptation of Macbeth or something, then be my guest, right? If you're a teacher, but you want to get into scholarship a bit more than a research proposal, go ahead, right? It's really up to you how you want to sort of like marry the goals of the course with your own personal, professional, intellectual, academic goals, right? So there's no strings attached as far as that's concerned. As long as you're meeting the criteria as identified on the assignment description on the syllabus, then that's totally fine. But I do expect each of you to email me in the coming days to let me know when would be a good time to meet with you, and we'll meet over Zoom. I'm not in New York right now. Um, I want to meet with each of you, just sort of get to know you, get to know your research interests, your scholarly interests, your teaching interests, right? What you're trying to get out of this course, right? Online courses can be somewhat, I get lonely might be the right word. They can be somewhat isolating, and so I'm trying to, through having you engage with your peers in the discussion posts, right, and also through having you do the meetings with me at an early juncture in the semester. I'm trying to make it so that this course is a bit more collaborative. It's a bit more interactive, right? It's not just I post a bunch of lectures and readings and things at the beginning of each week, and you do the work, and we never really correspond, right? I want this to be a collaborative experience. I want this to be an interactive experience as much as is possible for an online course, right? So I would like each of you to make time to meet with me in the next 2 weeks, maybe three, right? Because, if you come into the meeting with an idea of what you want to do for your final project, and through our discussion, you find out that you want to make changes or the idea as you initially conceived it isn't really practical, right? I want you to have enough time after our meeting to then go back and work on your project, right? So I think by week 3 of the summer session, at least, is when we should have our meeting. And I understand, many of you have spouses and children, many of you are traveling, many of you are working, right? So I understand that the summer is not the free time that we think it is, right? And I have my own research interests and things that I'm doing this summer. But given that this is an online course, and given that there are no set office hours that I'm expecting you to attend, right? It should be easy for us to find a time, sometime between now and a few weeks from now, to meet, chat briefly, get to know each other, learn about your interests, why you're taking the course, and what you want to do for the final project. Okay, so do make a point of meeting with me as soon as you can. Um, and I guess, as far as remember also, it's up to you what text you want to choose. I recommended a bunch on the syllabus, right? But there are some good online versions that you can, like through Folger or Shakespeare Library, that you can use. That's fine if you want a free copy, right? All of Shakespeare's texts are public domain, which is nice, right? So, you know, but I tend to prefer having physical copies, especially if I'm reading something for the first time, because you can write in the book, you can underline, make marginal notes, write long notes in the margins, right? That's just the reading experience that I prefer. And the physical text, if you go through like Oxford, Cambridge, Arden, even Folger, they have more extensive notes. They have long introductions. They explain the editorial work of putting together the edition, right? Because remember that Shakespeare's plays, the editions that you're reading, are not the exact versions of the plays that were published, 400 years ago, right? These texts are the process, or the product of an editorial process that takes the original text, right? The quarto versions, which are the single play publications, right? And the folio, right, which is the big collection of Shakespeare's plays, first published in 1623 by his friends and co-workers, Hemmings and Condell, right? Um, so editors today are making decisions on what is the authoritative text, right, based on reading, analyzing those early printed editions, right? So not all editions are created equal. Not all are of the same quality. Not all apply the same sort of like editorial rigor in the process, right? But if you're going with Arden, Oxford, Cambridge, or even the Folgers, then you're on solid ground, right? So try not to find some, weird mass-produced copy, right? Try to find the scholarly editions, right, that are put together by scholars, right? People who do this thing for a living, right? People who study this. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. So, to just sort of like put a pin in the syllabus discussion, keep an eye on your deadlines, keep an eye on the readings for each week, make sure that you're completing all the assignments on time, make sure you're doing the assignments according to the criteria on the syllabus, right? Let me know early and often if there's going to be a problem with you meeting deadlines, and also let me know early when we can meet to discuss final projects, and we can get together and discuss that. So, as a way of bringing you into the course, I assigned a framing lecture, right? It's a lecture that I've used for undergraduate classes, which is not to say that it's a more rudimentary or a more like dumbed down lecture or anything like that. It's basically just sort of like an overview of Shakespeare's time period, right? It's an overview of the kinds of sources and influences that Shakespeare and his other dramatists had, right? Both in terms of like, their education in the trivium and rhetoric and learning about history, right? The kinds of sources that they would adapt, and what early modern drama was as an art form, right? The genres that were popular, and also the commercial nature of early modern drama as a for-profit joint stock company. That's what the Chamberlain's Men and later the King's Men were, right? They had their royal patrons, but they made all of their money from ticket sales, right? So they are a profit-making institution, right? So that's all important to keep in mind. So take some time to listen to that. I think it'll be helpful for those of you who don't have a whole lot of knowledge coming into this class about Shakespeare's era, about early modern drama, right? I think it'll be useful, right? I reviewed it recently to make sure that there was nothing like glaringly wrong about it or archaic about it. So I hope it'll be useful to you. It's not, it's comprehensive to some extent, but it's also incomplete, and there's plenty of other resources that you can use to build on that foundation. I included in the syllabus a whole bibliography of secondary sources, monographs about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's art and time and everything. So if you want to do your own research, right, and you want to learn more about a specific topic in Shakespeare studies, then please go ahead and do so, right? Um, and I think it's important to mention that English literature as a discipline, right, is undergoing a bit of a, I guess you could say, a crisis, right? Because we all know that there's the idea that universities are not prioritizing their humanities departments the way they used to, right? Humanities departments are always subject to cuts and things like that, consolidations, right? For those of you who are interested in pursuing a PhD in English, you should know that the job market for PhDs is pretty horrendous, right? There are just too many applicants for too few positions. And there are very few universities looking to hire Shakespeare scholars, right? Which doesn't bode well for me as a Shakespeare scholar. Um, so there's that element to it, and there's also the fact that Shakespeare scholars are either trying to reckon with or trying to avoid reckoning with the fact that Shakespeare's art, Shakespeare's performance history, its history of print and reception and all of these things, that history is very much tied into history of systemic racism, history of colonialism, right? History of anti-Semitism, right? Also, Shakespeare's influence and Shakespeare's work is very much, sort of part of a patriarchal tradition as well, right? And so that's not to say that because, Shakespeare's plays have troubling subject matter and that they have a troubling history of performance and reception, that somehow means that we should just put away Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare's influence is so significant that for those of us who are students of English literature, it makes him very hard to ignore, right? And I also think that there's a lot of merit in what he does in terms of how he adapts source material, right? How he experiments with dramatic genres, right? How he uses his knowledge of rhetoric in order to create characters who seem to have some sort of an inner life, right? Some sort of a psychology, right? And the questions that he asks, about politics, about economics, about race, about religion, about gender, right? He poses about society, right? He, through his plays, doesn't necessarily make political statements, but he asks really interesting questions, right? And so all of those reasons are reasons why Shakespeare is worth studying, right? Not just because he's wonderful or great or the best, the genius, right? You know, those are things that are sort of part of like the myth of the bard, right? That I think that aren't terribly useful. I mean, it's useful in the terms of like how we form a literary identity, right? And how we tend to attribute to authors a certain mystique, right? But Shakespeare was a worker, and he was a shareholder in the company, and he was somebody who bought real estate, right? He was somebody who had commercial financial interests in mind when he was writing these plays, right? And even so, even with all of those material conditions that shape his art, he still manages to create interesting works, right? Works that are interesting for the way that they adapt source materials, for the way that they blend genres, for the way that they use language, right? For the way that they use certain symbols, metaphors, literary devices, figures of speech, right? And also for the way that they, respond to their historical moment and ask questions about society and sort of question common sense understandings and ideas, right? About everything from race, class, gender, sexuality, all of that, right? Which is not to say that Shakespeare is a progressive in any way, but there is something rather, there's a certain skepticism in his work and to some extent, a cynicism and also a questioning of society and a questioning of culture and a questioning of politics and all of those things that make his work, I think, worthwhile reading, right? Both in terms of like what they say about the time period and also how they've influenced authors, since then, right? But that having been said, it is important for us to consider how Shakespeare's text may be read and interpreted with an eye towards what they say about or how they, contribute to their role in a larger history of systemic racism, systemic anti-Semitism, systemic sexism, right? And how they might, at once question, but also, in a sense, traffic in and perpetuate this certain racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, and gender stereotypes, right? All of those things are important to keep in mind. And so the readings that I'm having you do for the first week, I assigned each of you an article, just so for those of you who are unfamiliar with Shakespeare scholarship can at least get your feet wet, right? And see what scholars in the last 20, 30 years or whatever have been writing about when it comes to Shakespeare, right? So some of you will be reading about how Shakespeare is taught. Some of you will be reading about how Shakespeare is interpreted through certain theoretical works, right? Some of you will be dealing with performance and reception history. Some of you will be dealing with textual scholarship, right? You'll be dealing with a whole host of issues. Some of you will be dealing with looking at Shakespeare through the lens of critical race studies, through the lens of gender and sexuality, through the lens of thinking about social justice, right? So I think the readings that I've selected and assigned to you, I assign them for no particular reason, alphabetically, right? The readings that I assigned to you are meant to sort of like just maybe broaden your horizons about what Shakespeare scholars are able to do with Shakespeare's work, right? And how they might be relevant given our current context, right? Our current, social, political, economic climate and whatnot. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I want you to do is read the 3 selections that I posted in the announcement. 2 of them are on the syllabus, right? The prologue to Henry V and Ben Jonson's Bartlemy Fair. One I added as a last-minute flight of fancy, John Webster's To the Reader letter at the beginning of The White Devil. John Webster, you might know, is the author of The Duchess of Malfi. So these selections provide you with 3 different examples of the dialectic between the author and the audience in Shakespeare's time. The prologue to Henry V, right? Some of you might know that play, right? About Hal, the warrior king, right? Basically, because early modern drama and because the stagecraft of early modern drama was fairly minimal and rudimentary, right? The prologue is asking the audience to use the powers of their imagination to fill in the gaps, right? Parse out our imperfections with your thoughts, right? Imagine that you are seeing battlefields and kings, right? Imagine that you are seeing, the vasty fields of France, right? Like, we are giving you the language, right? They say, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play at the end, right? When they talked about seeing a play, they would talk more about hearing the play. So it was as much, if not more, of an auditory experience than it was a visual one, right? And so, in a sense, by listening to the language of what the actors are saying, right, from there, it is left to the audience to imagine the horses, imagine the courts, and imagine the fields, the battlefields, imagine the scenery, the set, the backdrop, and all of that sort of stuff, right? That's not to say there was no set design, there was no stagecraft at all. That's not what I'm trying to say. But it was fairly minimal, and so this is asking audiences to use the powers of imagination in collaboration with the author and with the actors who are speaking the lines, right? In order to create the theatrical experience of seeing a play, in an early modern playhouse like the Globe, right? And what's also interesting is that it sort of gives you a sense of the performative nature of politics, right? And it also gives you a sense of the importance of public opinion, right? Public opinion, the public believes that someone is the king, right? And so that person is, in a sense, the king, right? Because, yes, obviously, who is in charge has everything to do with laws, right? And laws of succession, right? Traditions and things like that. But it also relies on public perception, right? So if the entire public no longer believes that you're in charge, then, are you in fact in charge, right? So it is an interesting example of how audiences, public opinion, spectators sort of like create dramatic art just as they sort of like create the polity, right? Because their opinion is very much an important part of this illusion of power that kings and queens and princes and nobles have, right? And when they stop believing, then you have rebellions, right? Um, so that's a really interesting way of thinking about the dialectic between the actors, the author, and the audience, right? And through their collaboration, creating dramatic art, right? Then there's Ben Jonson, who was a close contemporary of Shakespeare, also somebody who wrote for the Chamberlain's Men, the King's Men later on, right? A very famous and accomplished playwright, especially of comedies, right? Very popular in the court of James the First. And what he does, which is really interesting and humorous, is he reduces the author audience relationship to a contract, right? You have bought a ticket to see this play, and I, in exchange, will give you this product, right? This artistic commodity, right? This product, right? And so, but it basically sets the terms of their interpretation, right? You can only judge in proportion to how much money you spent to be in the theater, right? You can only sort of like expect from this play what the play is telling you to expect, right? Don't So this is a comedy about a fair, right? So don't expect something like a high flown important tragedy, right? Don't expect something like Titus Andronicus or the Spanish tragedy, right? Only expect what a play about a fair can afford, and you will see what you will see in a county fair, right, or in a local fair, right, where the fair is itself a little microcosm of capitalism, right? It's a market, right? And so it's interesting how in a play about a market and all of the chaotic things that happen in the market, all the buying and the selling and everything, that Johnson then reduces the relationship, or he describes the relationship between playing company, author, right? In these articles of agreement, he describes it as a relationship between a buyer and a seller, right? Between a vendor and a customer, right? Um, so it's in a sense, even though obviously Ben Jonson had certainly a more like he was somebody who really asserted his own authorship, right? His own intellectual ownership of his work, right? And he clearly had a very sort of like high opinion of himself and his own work, right? And he resented audiences for misinterpreting his plays, right? And he even says, like, don't look at this play and think like, oh, which person in real life are these characters meant to represent, right? He's in a sense worrying about, or showing that he's worrying about, censorship, misinterpretation, right? He's worried about spies in the audience trying to like get him in trouble with the law, and he is somebody who was often in trouble with the law for his plays and for his own private personal behavior, right? In a way that Shakespeare never was, right? Ben Jonson flew far closer to the sun than Shakespeare did as a dramatist. Um, so all of that is interesting because of the way that he, in this Articles of Agreement, he says, listen, let's just call it what it is. I am selling something and you're buying something, so let's make a contract, right? So it's reflecting sort of like the increasingly litigious nature of England as a culture during this time, and how contractual agreements were part of everyday life, right? And we'll see a very important example of a contractual agreement in The Merchant of Venice. Um, but he is reducing the relationship between the author and the audience to that of a contract, right? Like this is basically just a capitalist enterprise, and we're producing dramatic commodities for your consumption, right? So it's a very sort of like ingenious way of conceiving of the audience and author relationship. And then there's John Webster, who basically admits in his To the Reader letter that the play that he wrote, The White Devil, was a spectacular failure on the stage. And he blames the audience for its failure. For it was a bad time of year, and they're not a very sophisticated audience. They didn't understand the play, right? And so he blames the audience for the failure, the audience in the theater for the failure. And so he thinks that he's going to have a better reception and that his work will be better appreciated by those who read the play in print, right? So he's distinguishing between his audience in the theater and his audience, his reading audience, his literate audience. Now, as I mentioned in the framing lecture, people who went to the theater in Shakespeare's day, many of them were literate, many of them were of the professional class, many of them were lawyers, scribes, apprentices, students, right? They were not a sort of like an uncouth or illiterate, rabble, right? As people, some critics have made it out to be. They were a far more eclectic and diverse audience. But Webster is distinguishing the playwright's relationship with their audience in the playhouse to the playwright's relationship with the audience in print, thinking that he can have a better more success in print, right? So there's this interesting competition between, for a playwright, between putting things on the stage, right, and subjecting your work to an audience in person, right, and then the audience in print. So this interesting contrast between plays in print and plays in performance, right? And Shakespeare is a playwright who wrote for the stage. He wrote for his actors. He wrote for an audience, right? And he wrote for their varying tastes, right, and interests and priorities, right? He was certainly somebody who knew the what was popular at the time, and he did interesting things with popular genres. But he was again writing in very popular genres, right? So Shakespeare, it's not really clear to what extent he had an interest in the publication of his plays, right? Both a personal interest and a financial interest. It's not very clear, right? Intellectual property was a very sort of like nebulous concept, right? And who owned the plays? Not really the author of the play so much as the playing company and then the printer, right? So these three selections give you three different ways of thinking about the author and the playwrights and the playing company's relationship to their audience. One that relies on the audience to make the play a coherent thing, right, through their imagination, through hearing the play. One where it's basically a contract between a buyer and a seller, and one where it's basically an author trying to find a reception in print that he could not find in performance, right? Thinking about plays as a literary printed art form in addition to a sort of like a performance and ephemeral art form, right? So the competition between plays in print and plays in performance, right? So those are a few different ways of conceiving of the author's relationship with their audience and also their relationship with their time period, right? And how they conceive of their work, right? And how it relates to the work of others, right? So those are just a few sort of like preliminary texts to keep in mind, and they will inform your writing the first discussion post, right? So I'm giving you a lot this first week in terms of like the article assignment, in terms of the framing lecture, in terms of this lecture, right? And in terms of these primary readings, right? But all that put together should still keep you within the 6 to 10 hours a week, right? And you shouldn't have a problem completing the first assignments. So I hope that you all get a lot out of the class. I hope that you get out of it what you hope, but also find things that you didn't know before, and that you knew things to get out of it that you didn't anticipate. And keep in communication with me as far as readings, assignments, deadlines. If there's any problem with Brightspace, I'm not very pleased with it as a LMS, as a platform, but we'll make the best of it as best we can, right? And be in touch with regards to when you want to meet about your final projects. And I hope that you enjoy this course. I hope that you get a lot out of this course. I hope that you're able to make this course work for your own personal, intellectual, academic interests, right? And I hope that we have a good time collaborating with each other, and learning a lot from each other. And I'm looking forward to reading your work, getting to know each of you, and of course seeing your final projects. And for those of you who are in New York in the summer, it's a great time to go see a Shakespeare play. So if you've never seen one in performance before, that's what it's made for, right? Shakespeare's plays are written for the stage. So please seek them out to the extent that you are able. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, and best of luck, and we'll be in touch.